Well, I hope you've had a wonderful Lord's Day, and I am excited to study with you again tonight as we're just about ready to wrap up II Thessalonians. My plan tonight is to cover chapter 3, verses 6 through 15. And then on Wednesday, we just have 3 verses left, and then I wanted to do some final review and reflections. And most of that I would love to be feedback from you about different things that you've learned from the Thessalonian letters that maybe you hadn't noticed before. So I really would love for you to send me an email and just drop me some of your thoughts. If you don't, it's going to be a very, very short Bible study on Wednesday night. So I really do hope to hear from you. So what we're going to do is read the passage first, and then I want to do some background work on the issue that Paul is talking about here, and then we'll kind of work our way through the text. So 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 6. Now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness and not in accord with the tradition that you receive from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with toil and labor we worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. It was not because we did not have that right, but to give you in ourselves an example to imitate. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busybodies. Now, such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. As for you, brothers, do not grow weary in doing good. If anyone does not obey what we say in this letter, take note of that person and have nothing to do with him, that he may be ashamed. Do not regard him as an enemy, but warn him as a brother. Now, the issue here that Paul raises has to do with working to support yourself and not relying on others. This is an issue that actually he raised in the first letter. He broached the topic in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 10, when he says at the end of that verse, "But we urge you, brothers, to do this and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands, as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders, and be dependent on no one." And then also in chapter 5 and verse 14, he said that among those that they were to interact with, they were to admonish the idle. Now, the big question facing commentators is exactly what was the problem behind the unwillingness of some of the Thessalonians to work. And there are basically 2 possibilities that are set forth by commentators. One of these possibilities is that there were some of the Thessalonians who believed that the second coming was just around the corner, and therefore there was no reason to work because the end was about to come. A more recent, and by the way, the evidence within the letters for that would be that we learned in chapter 2 that there were indeed people at Thessalonica who were confused about the issue of the second coming, the timing of the second coming. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, and I think it's the one that more recent commentators have set forth, has to do with a social arrangement that's kind of hard, I think, for us to really wrap our minds around. But it's a social arrangement called patronage. Now, we are a little bit familiar with patronage in our culture, particularly in government, when somebody gets elected and then they give jobs to the people who help to support them. And sometimes that's called patronage. In the first century world, there were a lot of these client-patron relationships in which the wealthy, the upper class, would acquire for themselves clients that they would then give money to and support. in exchange of which the clients would then enhance their social standing by pledging political loyalty to them for whatever public issues they wanted to get involved in. One of the reasons that this is so hard for us to understand is we would say something probably like, why don't you just go get a job? But in some places in the first century world, work was not held in high regard like it is in our culture. I mean, in our culture, we have great respect. If someone works hard, sweeping floors or digging ditches or washing dishes, we have great regard for people who are willing to do tough, hard, dirty jobs and work hard at it and do so with integrity. But that was not necessarily the case in the first century. Maybe one way to illustrate the mindset that was often prevailing. Do you remember that Jesus tells a parable in Luke chapter 16 about this dishonest accountant? Sometimes he's called the dishonest steward or manager. And what Jesus says in the story is that his employer finds out that he's been cooking the books, and so he tells him that he's going to fire him. And so when he gets the news that he's going to be fired, he decides that he's going to write those who are in debt and to his boss and give him a discount, hoping that then they'll help him out when he's out of a job. And when he explains why he does this, he's thinking to himself. Jesus says in Luke 16 and verse 3, the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? Now listen, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. So if you think about it, here is a culture where he doesn't want to do manual labor, he's not strong enough, and he doesn't want to beg. Well, another option would be one of these patronage relationships. Well, if that is the background, then what Paul is saying is to the Christians at Thessalonica, I don't want you to get involved in those. I don't want you to become dependent on other people. And I think that this is something that you can see sort of as a strain through many of Paul's letters. He does not want Christians to become dependent on other people. He wants them to be independent so that their dedication to Christ cannot in any way be influenced or massaged or in some way corrupted. Well, I think that second viewpoint, the idea of client patronage as the issue here at Thessalonica, is probably the right solution, but the bigger practical application points are going to be the same regardless. All right, now let's walk our way through the text, all right? So in verse 6, the Apostle Paul says this, now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Notice these are not suggestions, these are commands under the authority of Jesus Christ himself, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness. This word, idleness, we also saw in the first letter. Some translations will render it walks disorderly or leads an unruly life. The basic idea is you don't follow orders. It could be used like in the military for those who are insubordinate. In this case, it is those who are not following the directives that were given by the apostles, as becomes clear in the next phrase when the end of verse 6 says, and not in accord with the tradition that you received from us. Now remember, he's already mentioned that tradition. Back up in chapter 2, verse 15, so then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by our spoken word or by our letter. So he's already emphasized this point, and that's what the problem is here, is he has done some teaching on this topic previously, and still among the Thessalonians there are those who are disobedient to it. Verse 7, for you yourselves know. So we've seen that kind of phrase a lot in these letters where Paul constantly calls back to things that he's already taught the Thessalonians that they are already supposed to know. In this case, he reminds them of the example he set. You yourselves know how you ought to imitate us because we were not idle when we were with you. We did not behave without discipline, the New American Standard says, or disorderly, the New King James Version says. And by the way, this is a good time for all of us to remind ourselves that when you are a teacher, and almost all of us are teachers, whether you're an elder or a preacher or a Bible class teacher or a parent, that you teach by your example as much as by anything else. I know that a lot of times through the years in preaching, when I've been frustrated with the congregation for one reason or the other, for not doing what I think they should, a lot of the time, if I just look in the mirror, I realize, well, you're not doing it, so why should they do it? So it is really important for us to set a good example. And that's what Paul says he was doing. Specifically in not being idle, not refusing to work. Instead, he says in verse 8, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you. So here is the specific unruliness that the apostle has in mind, those who are not working. He says, I set you an example. I worked night and day. In other words, he would have done his day job, making tents, and then at night he would have been doing the work of preaching and teaching, so as not to rely on anybody else's support. Like he said back in the first letter, in chapter 2 and verse 9, for you remember, brothers, our labor and toil, we worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. Now, Paul is quick to say he had every right to accept financial support from the Thessalonians. He says in verse 9, it was not because we do not have that right, but to give you and ourselves an example to imitate. Paul's unwillingness to accept any financial support from the Thessalonians was rooted in his desire to be a model for them, as the NASB and the NIV put it, to set an example for them. You see this pattern in several of Paul's church relationships, where he will willingly set aside a right that he has to something because he believes it's in the best interest of that congregation. And a lot of times it has to do with money. I'm thinking about over in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul tells the Corinthians that he had the right to accept financial support from them while he preached for them, but he refused it. He says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 6, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? So he says, I had the right to accept financial support from you. But then he says in the middle of verse 12, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Later in the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul says that one of the reasons he did not accept financial support from the Corinthians is he wanted to sharply distinguish the way he went about doing ministry from the false apostles, who of course wanted to get as much money as they could from the Corinthians. In the same way, I'm wondering if the reason Paul did not accept financial support from the Thessalonians is because if he knew that there were a lot of people there involved in these patron-client relationships of dependency, even though that was not what his relationship was going to be with the Thessalonians had they supported him, they may have thought that was their relationship. And so therefore, Paul may have decided, I'm not going to allow them to lapse into thinking that they are my patron and I am their client. So it's a good lesson for those of us who are preachers that, and for really all of us as Christians, we don't need to think about our rights in the absolute sense. Well, what about my rights? We also need to think about what is best for others. And in the case of financial support, Paul often forfeited that right. Now, what we know from other letters, like in Philippians 4, we know that sometimes he would, like say if he was, boy, that was hillbilly coming out, like say, if he was preaching at Corinth, he would not necessarily accept money from the Corinthians, but he might let the Philippians, for example, send him financial support. And that way the people he was working with could not get into these false notions of like maybe a client patronage relationship or maybe some kind of mindset, we're paying for you so we get to tell you what to teach, that kind of thing. But again, he had the right to take money from all of these churches that he was working for. But he would also balance his right with what he thought was most needed for the Thessalonians or the Corinthians or whoever it was. All right, so let's get back now to II Thessalonians 3, and I think we've made it up to verse 10 now. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command. So in other words, when I was there with you in person at Thessalonica, I told you, here is the command from the Lord. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. That's why Paul is so sharp, you might say, here in this section of the letter in terms of dealing with this issue, because at this point, it's disobedience is nothing short of absolute defiance of apostolic authority. And so he's having to tingle with that. The problem is, what Paul is telling them is contrary to their social convention. And, that's always a hard thing to overcome. And, we have to be on guard against that as well. He says this in verse 11, for we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busy bodies. Now, this is one of those times where a good effort at translation may create the wrong impression with us. When I think of a busybody, honestly, the first thing that comes to my mind, if you've ever seen The Music Man, are the pick a little ladies. They pick a little, talk a little, pick a little, talk a little, cheep, 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 talk a lot, pick a little more. So that's kind of like the stereotypical busybody. But the reason the ESV says not busy at work, but busy bodies is because in Greek, Paul uses the same word as the word busy at work, and then that word is incorporated into the word that's translated busybody. So it's an effort to try to replicate in English what's happening in Greek. The problem is when we think of busybodies, at least if you're like me, I have a certain stereotype in my mind, and that's probably not what Paul had in mind here, especially if the issue he was dealing with was the issue of patronage. Most likely in that case, to be a busybody would be someone who was so heavily involved as the client of one of those patrons, constantly going to argue for that patron's position on whatever social issue may have been at hand, that they were just always in the mix of the town's affairs and swept up by that, which of course could become a very serious preoccupation to draw their attention away from important spiritual matters. And so Paul says in verse 12, here's the remedy. Now, such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. Don't get into one of these relationships of dependency. You need to be independent if possible. Now, let me just hasten to add here that what he's saying is don't voluntarily get into a relationship of dependency. We know, in fact, in the next verse, he's going to touch on this, I think, that there are times that all of us have faced financial problems in which we needed help from someone else. That's not what Paul is talking about here. Paul is talking about people who are deliberately choosing not to work, either because they think the Lord's about to come, or as I tend to think now, because they're into one of these, client-patron relationships. But whatever the reason is, the end result of it is they have voluntarily chosen to be a burden to someone else. Paul says, I don't want you to do that. Do your work quietly, what we might say the quiet life. You need to pursue the quiet life and earn your own living. Paul wants them to settle down, the NIV says, and support themselves. I may have shared this quote with you back when we touched on this point in the first letter, but it's so funny to me. I want to share it again. This is a first century non-biblical writer, obviously Philo, who writes about the opposite of the quiet life. In fact, he uses the same word in Greek that Paul does is here when he uses the word silence toward the end of this quote. I think this is pretty funny because it reminds me of a lot of social media, to be honest. Besides, the worthless man whose life is one long restlessness haunts marketplaces, theaters, law courts, council halls, assemblies, and every group and gathering of men. His tongue he lets loose for unmeasured, endless, indiscriminate talk, bringing chaos and confusion into everything, mixing true with false, fit with unfit, public with private, holy with profane, sensible with absurd, because he has not been trained to that silence, that's the word Paul uses when he says to work quietly, which in season is most excellent. They keep their ears open in meddlesome curiosity. Well, that would be what you would have to do if you were someone's client. You're always having to try to stir things up on behalf of the one who is supporting you. Paul says, I don't want you to be involved in that kind of stuff. Now then, in verse 13, it seems to me he shifts from talking about such persons in verse 12 who were walking in idleness to a different group of people. When he says, as for you, brothers, do not grow weary in doing good. So this could be just a general exhortation. There's a similar statement found to that over in the book of Galatians, in Galatians chapter 6, right after the passage where Paul talks about the law of sowing and reaping and that you reap what you sow. He says this in Galatians 6, verse 9, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. But then in the next verse he says, so then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith. So you'll notice that not being weary in doing good is closely connected in Paul's mind with helping people who are in need, especially those who are Christians. So when we come back now to II Thessalonians 3:13, and he says, don't grow weary in doing good, it may be that Paul has in mind the same connection that we just saw in Galatians. It might be this line of thought. There are some Thessalonians who are not working, and they have chosen not to because they are in one of these weird relationships. Those people need to get a job. But on the other hand, there are people who genuinely are in need, and you can't allow yourself to become too tired to help them just because of the errors of others. So don't be weary in doing good. Some people are genuinely in need. And I know I have felt that frustration. I bet some of you have too. When you try to be generous and you help people and then you find out you've been taken, and it can make you very cynical, and as a result of that, unwilling to want to help anybody. And so that's when you kind of need the reminder, don't be weary in doing good, which Paul says. Now then, verse 14, if anyone does not obey what we say in this letter, take note of that person and have nothing to do with him, that he may be ashamed. So those who refuse the apostolic instructions, which Paul has now given 3 times, from what he said in this letter, he gave them in person, then he gave them in the first letter, now he's given them again in this second letter. And if they still are refusing, what they're basically saying is, we don't intend to cooperate. We're not going to be a part of the Christian family. We don't want to cooperate. We don't want to follow the rules. And in that case, Paul says, acknowledge that that's exactly what they are doing. And what he says is, you need to social distance. So this is a different kind of social distancing. The social distancing that we've been talking about has to do with protecting ourselves from the spread of a physical disease. Well, this is to prevent the spread of spiritual disease. In addition to that, it is also to have an effect on the sinful brother. It is that he may be ashamed. Now, in our culture, we are ashamed of the word shame. In fact, there's a lot of criticisms about things like body shaming, even to the point that, someone who's overweight like me, you're not even supposed to mention that you're overweight. I know I'm overweight, and I wish I wasn't, and I know it's not great for me, and I work on it, and I fight the battle, but there's donuts, so it's just a problem, all right? I don't consider it body shaming if somebody points out the obvious. But, of course, there's a way to be denigrating. There's a way that somebody could say things that are for my good, and there's a way that somebody could say something that's designed to be malicious and mean. Well, Paul obviously doesn't mean for us to be malicious and mean to this brother. That's not the kind of shame he is talking about. But it is the kind of positive shame, what you might call positive peer pressure, that is designed to say to someone, we love you, but we love the Lord, and we can't have you in our fellowship if you're going to keep doing what you're doing. And we have to acknowledge that you're no longer walking in step with Jesus. And this is the way that we will express that. And we hope that it will bring that person to the shame that says, if my family can't have anything to do with me because of the way I'm living, I must have really screwed up. I need to make things right. That's the point of this. It's not to denigrate the person. It's not to humiliate or disgrace the person. It's designed to appeal to their conscience so that we can awaken their conscience so that they will want to please the Lord and do what is right. And that motive is certainly clear with how Paul concludes the paragraph when he says in verse 15, do not regard him as an enemy, but warn him as a brother. So you might say that church discipline is on the one hand punitive. That is to say, there is punishment involved. There is to be a sense of pain or shame felt in the one who is disciplined. But it is certainly redemptive. The shame that they may feel, the pain they may feel, is not the end. That's not the objective. It's a means to an end. And the means to an end is their redemption, to win them back to the Lord, to win them back to the family of Jesus Christ. And so that's why Paul says, don't regard him as an enemy. He's your brother, but he is in serious need of warning. And so reach out to him and approach him with just that mindset. Well, that gets us through now most of the letter. We just basically have the final prayer of Paul, and then the final signature of Paul and the final blessing that he gives to the people. And then we'll wrap up. And I realize that our class situation is in a little bit of flux right now, but I believe that I said to you that I was intending for the month of September, at least on Sunday mornings, to do a Bible class on heaven. And I know that, our situation is very fluid, and the elders are constantly having to think about how to make plans to adjust to what's going on. But just sort of plan for right now. Maybe it's going to be for the month of September, Sunday and Wednesday. I'm not sure. But I want to do sort of a mini class before the fall quarter begins, hopefully. Knock on wood. I want to do a mini class on heaven. It's something I've told you about even in studying this letter that I just haven't done enough teaching on, and it's an important part of the gospel message. And so I'm going to be working on that to try to scrape some things together to talk about that topic. But in the meantime, please remember, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what was new for you this time going through Thessalonians. What was different for you going through it this time? What are some insights that you've gained from the letter that have helped you? I'd really like to hear from you. If for no other reason, if I get an email from you and you say something, then it lets me know that it hasn't just been me staring at this camera talking to it for the last couple of months or so, but somebody's actually been, tuning in and listening. But in any event, stay safe, take care of each other, and Lord willing, we'll study and finish up the letter on Wednesday. Love you guys, and hope your week gets off to a wonderful start.